On the 16th of October, 2025, we look back at a moment that tested a young nation to its core. The year was 1791. The United States was a fragile experiment, barely a decade old, burdened by the immense debts of its own creation. A new tax was introduced, a seemingly minor levy on distilled spirits, yet this single tax on whiskey would ignite a fire of rebellion on the western frontier, posing a direct challenge to the authority of the fledgling federal government. It pitted the power of a centralized state against the rights and livelihoods of its citizens. The stakes could not have been higher. The very survival of the republic hung in the balance, forcing leaders to confront a fundamental question of governance. The whiskey tax mattered profoundly. It was not merely a financial burden for many. For farmers in the rugged, isolated hills of western Pennsylvania, whiskey was more than a beverage. It was a currency. It was a medium of exchange. It was the most practical way to transport their grain harvest to distant markets. Taxing their primary economic product felt like an attack on their way of life, imposed by a distant government that seemed to have little understanding of their struggles. This was not just about money, it was about fairness, representation, and the fear that a powerful new government would replicate the very injustices they had fought a revolution to escape. The confrontation that followed was the first serious test of federal authority under the new constitution. How the government responded would set a crucial precedent for the future. Would it allow its laws to be openly defied, risking a descent into anarchy and the dissolution of the Union? Or would it use force to compel obedience, potentially alienating a significant portion of its population and betraying revolutionary ideals of liberty? President George Washington and his administration faced a perilous choice. Their decision would determine the immediate outcome and shape the relationship between the American government and its people for generations to come. This story is one of high drama, played out against the backdrop of a nation finding its feet. It involves passionate leaders, ordinary people, driven to extraordinary measures, and a clash of deeply held principles. The Whiskey Rebellion was a crucible where federal power and individual rights were forged into concrete reality. It was a moment that tested the promise of a united republic, forcing Americans to decide what kind of nation they truly wanted to be. The echoes of that decision and the tensions it revealed can still be felt in political discourse today. To understand why a tax on whiskey could provoke such a powerful reaction, one must first appreciate the precarious state of the new American nation. The Revolutionary War had been won, but it had come at a staggering cost. The country was saddled with enormous debts owed to foreign nations, owed to its own citizens. The national treasury was empty. The government under the old Articles of Confederation had been too weak to raise the necessary funds. This financial instability threatened the nation's credibility on the world stage and its very survival. A bold and comprehensive solution was desperately needed. The architect of this solution was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton envisioned a strong, centralized federal government with a robust national economy. His financial plan was multifaceted and controversial. He proposed that the federal government assume the war debts of the individual states, a move designed to bind the states more closely to the national government. To pay off these consolidated debts, he planned to establish a national bank and, crucially, to raise revenue through a series of federal taxes. Hamilton believed these measures would establish public credit and foster economic growth. One key component was an excise tax on domestically produced distilled spirits. From his perspective, this was a logical choice. Whiskey was seen by some in eastern cities as a luxury item. Taxing it seemed a way to raise money without taxing land or property. Hamilton also saw a political benefit. He knew it would be unpopular in certain regions. He believed enforcing a federal law, despite resistance, would demonstrate the new government's authority and its ability to govern the entire nation. However, the plan failed to account for the western frontier's economic realities. For farmers in western Pennsylvania, Appalachia, and the Ohio Valley, converting surplus grain into whiskey was economic survival. Transporting bulky sacks of rye or corn to eastern markets was prohibitively expensive. Whiskey, by contrast, was far more compact. Whiskey was durable. Whiskey was more valuable by volume. It did not spoil. It was easy to transport on pack animals. It often served as a form of currency in a cash-poor region. The tax, therefore, was not a tax on a luxury, but a direct tax on their most vital commodity. The act repealing, after the last day of June next, the duties heretofore laid upon distilled spirits imported from abroad, and laying others in their stead, and also upon spirits distilled within the United States, was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Washington on the 3rd of March, 1791. The law was complex, but its effect was clear. It imposed the first ever federal tax on a domestic product. The tax could be paid as a flat fee or at a rate per gallon. Larger, more efficient distilleries in the East paid a lower rate per gallon. Small, less efficient stills operated by frontier farmers. This disparity immediately created a sense of injustice among the Westerners. They felt the law was deliberately structured to benefit the wealthy urban distillers at the expense of the small rural producers. To them, it was a classic case of the powerful financial interests of the East dominating the political process and imposing their will on the agrarian West. The tax was not just a financial hardship.